The war with the Goths, hashtag Procopius Caesariensis De Bello Gothico. At about the same time, the Goths, who had settled in Thrace with the permission of the Belisarius, rose up in arms against the Romans under the leadership of Theoderic, who had been elevated to patrician and consul in Byzantium. Emperor Zeno, knowing how to take advantage of the favorable circumstances, persuaded Theoderic to march to Italy against Odoacer and seize power over the Western Empire for himself and the Goths. Theoderic, delighted with the proposal, set off for Italy, followed by the entire Gothic people, who loaded their children, women, and all the belongings they could carry onto carts. One, the name Carthage, Carthago, or Carthago in Latin, has ancient Bulgarian origins. Cart is the Bulgarian Turkic word for old or ancient. The second part, agon, comes from Latin and is similar to the verb ago, which has a bunch of meanings. 1. To move, to translate into motion. 2. To walk, to come. 3. To pursue, to chase. 4. To move. 5. To throw, etc. The first component of the Latin word carth is K. In Latin, there are only 4 written words beginning with K, and another of them is calicund, from which the word calendar comes. The use of K indicates that the word has ancient origins, probably through the Etruscans, from the Atriacs of Atriac, ancient Bulgarian Troy. In Old Bulgarian, the name of the city is spelled caps BCBV, where car is analogous to the Bulgarian cart dash 4 5 cov, can be derived as a participle form of the verb 5 oviko -1. To move, to shake. 2. To chase away. 3. Throw, which has a similar meaning to the second Latin component ago, and our backslash is a connecting particle. By this logic, the etymology of Carthage can be derived as an ancient route, road, ancient, old and familiar, an inevitable place where people, caravans, and ships pass through. As is evident geographically, Carthage is located on the northernmost cape of Africa, albeit in a very shallow bay, solely because it is located in this strategic place. The reason why we include the ancient Bulgarians in the geographical location of Carthage is that it was a colony of the Phoenicians, dating back to the end of the first millennium BC, on the site of a settlement previously founded by their Bulgarian ancestors. They called this country Benik. The Phoenicians and Philistines, Palestinians, are derivative peoples of the ancient Bulgarians of Ars Barsili, Hyksos, who had a presence of about 800 years in this Mediterranean region, connected with the conquest of Egypt in the 18th century BC, and until their withdrawal to Asia Minor at the end of the millennium. However, during their rule over Egypt, they conquered all of North Africa, where the Libyan tribe and the Berber tribes in the desert regions are descendants of the Bulgarians who migrated there over several centuries around the middle of the second millennium. At that time, the Bulgarians conquered the Aegean Islands, Crete, all of Greece and North Africa, Spain, France, and Great Britain, where they left many place names that are still used today. On the Spanish coast, the Phoenicians also fortified the city of Carthage, today Cartagena, south of present-day Toledo. Inland, there was a settlement called Carthagia, Carthaca, with a name of Phoenician origin, according to tradition. On the southern coast of the Aegean island of Kos, at a key location, there was a port called Carthaca, today Cartagena. On the southern coast of the Aegean island of Kos, there was a port called Carthaca, today Cartagena. The name of the Carthaginian general Hamilcar Barca, 277 to 229 BC, can be analyzed as Ham, changed from the title Canner, Can, and Milker, the word Bulgar in Near Eastern languages, and Barca is Barsa from the tribe Barsili or the Bulgarian Avars, the so-called Hyksos, who conquered Egypt around 1723 BC. The name of Hannibal Barca, 247 to 183 BC, can similarly be derived from Ham, changed from the title Canner, Khan, and Bal as Bulgarian or Baltivar, and Barca is Barsa from the tribe Barsili or the Bulgarian Avars, the so-called Hyksos. The name of the city of Barcelona in Spain also comes from the Barsili. At that time, Belisarius enjoyed great fame because of his victories over Gelimer and the Vandals. When he learned what had happened to Amalasuntha, the Belisarius immediately started a war. This was in the 9th year of his reign. He ordered Mund, commander-in-chief in Illyria, to march to Dalmatia, which was Gothic territory, and try to capture Ceylon. Mund was of barbarian descent, but he was loyal to the emperor and skilled in military affairs. He sent Belisarius with the fleet, giving him 4,000 regular soldiers and federates, and about 3,000 from the Isaurians. Their commanders were the renowned Constantine and Bess of Thrace and Perennius of Iberia, bordering Media, who was of the royal family of Iberia. He had previously fled to the Romans because of a feud with the Persians. The regular cavalry was commanded by Valentinus, Magnus, and Innocentius, the infantry by Herodian, Paul, Demetrius, and Ursicinus, and the Isaurian commander was in. 200 Huns and 300 Marusians followed as allies. He was followed by Phocios, the son from his first marriage to Antonia, who was still young and had barely grown a beard, but was very sensible and distinguished himself with greater physical strength for his age. This city of Benevento, lying opposite Dalmatia, was once founded by Diomedes, son of Tydeus, who after the capture of Ilion was expelled from Argos. It is said that here Diomedes met Aeneas, son of Anchises, who had sailed from Ilion and, according to legend, gave him the statue of Athena, which he had managed to steal together with Odysseus when the two went to spy on Ilion before it was captured by the Hellenes. They say that when, after some time, he fell ill and consulted the god about the reasons, he was given a prophecy that he would never be freed from misfortune until he handed over the statue to a man from Troy. The Romans say they do not know where it is now, but they show a copy of the image carved on a stone. In my time, it still stood in the temple of Tyche, Fortune, in front of the bronze statue of Athena, placed outdoors on the eastern side of the temple. This image on the stone is of a warrior raising a spear as if in battle. However, her chiton reaches down to her feet. Her face does not resemble the Greek image of Athena, but is entirely like those made in ancient Egypt. According to the Byzantines, Emperor Constantine buried this statue in the square named after him. It borders the region of Percomes, followed by Dalmatia and what belongs to the Eastern Empire. Next come Liburnia, Istria, and the land of the Veneti, reaching as far as the city of Ravenna. Such are the coastal peoples living in these places. To the north, the Scythians and the Swabians occupy the lands in the middle, and behind them are the Carni and the Nerusai. To their right live the Dacians and Pannonians, who, among other places, rule Singidunum and Sirmium, located on the river Ister. At the beginning of this war, the Goths ruled over these tribes on this side of the Ionian Gulf, and north of the city of Ravenna, on the left bank of the river Pa, lived the Ligurians. Belisarius fortified all the areas around Rome as far as the Tiber River, and after everything had been done in the best possible way, he ordered many of his shield-bearers and spearmen, including the Massagetæ Xanter, horsemen, and Aeshmen, as well as to the rest of the army, which he had attached to Constantine, to march to Tuscia, Etruria, to subjugate those places as well. He informed Bess that he had conquered Narni, the best fortified city in Tuscia. Bess was a Goth by nationality, a people who had long lived in Thrace and did not follow Theoderic when he led the Goths from there to Italy. He was energetic and knowledgeable in military affairs. He was an excellent commander, skilled in both left and right flanks. With the consent of the inhabitants of Narnia, he took it, and Constantine easily subjugated Spoleto, Perugia, and some other small settlements, and the Tuscans voluntarily accepted him into their towns. After that, the Romans no longer dared to expose themselves to danger in battles with their entire army, as before, but carried out sudden sorties on horseback and most often defeated the barbarians. Even infantrymen came out on both sides, but not in large battle phalanxes, but in small detachments accompanied by horsemen. Once, during the first attack, Bess rushed into the enemy ranks with a spear in his hand and killed 3 of the most famous Gothic horsemen, putting the rest to flight. In turn, Constantine, having led the Huns out onto the uneven field late in the evening, and seeing that the enemies outnumbered him, did the following. Since ancient times, there had been a large stadium here, where the gladiators of Rome fought in ancient times. The old inhabitants of the city had built many different buildings around this stadium, and so naturally, narrow passages had formed everywhere here. Then Constantine, unable to defeat such a large crowd of Goths or retreat without exposing himself to further risk, ordered all the Huns to dismount from their horses and stood with them on foot in one of these narrow passages. From there, they shot arrows at their enemies, killing many of them. The Goths who were hit by the arrows held out for a while, hoping that when the Huns ran out of arrows, they would easily surround them, tie them up, and take them to their camp. However, the Massagetae, who were excellent archers, shot into the crowd with their arrows, hitting almost every time one enemy or another, and the Goths, seeing that by sunset more than half of their men had been killed, already uncertain what to do, turned to flee. The Massagetae pursued them, and since they were skilled at shooting with a bow even at full gallop, they continued to hit them in the back as they fled. Thus, Constantine returned to Rome with the Huns during the night. There is a temple dedicated to the Apostle Paul, located 14 stadia from the walls of Rome, with the Tiber River flowing alongside it. There are no fortifications there, but there is a colonnade leading from the city to the temple itself, and numerous buildings have been erected around it. All this makes the place not entirely accessible. In addition, the Goths have a kind of reverence for these holy places. Not a single temple of the two apostles, Peter and Paul, was subjected to any desecration during the entire war, so that the priests could perform their sacred services as usual. At this place, Belisarius ordered Valerian to take all the Huns with him and build a fortified camp on the banks of the Tiber so that they could graze their horses safely and the Goths would refrain from straying too far from their camp. He did so. Having done all this, Belisarius remained calm, without initiating a general attack, and prepared to defend the walls with all his might if anyone approached them with hostile intentions. For their part, the Huns, having set up camp as mentioned, in the vicinity of the Goths, caused them no small amount of trouble, so that the Goths themselves began to suffer from hunger, because they could no longer obtain provisions with the same safety as before. In addition, many of them were struck by dysentery and many died, especially in the camp which, as mentioned, they had set up near the Alps. A few of those who remained alive withdrew to other fortifications. The same thing happened to the Huns, and so they returned to Rome. Around the summer solstice, Belisarius left a small guard in Rome and took everyone else with him, setting out against Vitiges and the Gothic camp. He sent a few men to Tudors and Clusium and ordered them to build fortifications so that he could follow them and surround the barbarians who had settled there. When they learned of the approaching army and, not wanting to be in danger, they sent envoys to Belisarius and promised to surrender with the two cities, but on condition that they would not suffer in any way, and upon his arrival, they fulfilled their promise. He then moved all the Goths from there to Sicily and Naples, stationed guards in Clusium and Tudors, and continued on with his army. At the same time, Vitiges sent troops under the command of Vasimus to Auxum, with orders to join forces with the Goths there to march together against the enemies in Ancona and to try to capture the fortress. Ancona is a rock bent at a right angle, which is why it got its name Ancona. Angle, more like an extended elbow. It is located about 80 stadia from Auxum, which serves as its port. The fortress is safely located on the rock, while the many buildings outside the fortress from ancient times stand unprotected. Conon, who commanded the defenders of the fortress, upon hearing that Vasimus was approaching quickly and was already nearby, ordered something unreasonable. He left the fortress almost without troops, whom he led 5 stages away and built them into a shallow phalanx to cover the foot of the mountain, as if setting an ambush for hunting. But when they saw the superior hordes opposite them, they turned and ran to the fortress. The pursuing barbarians killed many of those who had not managed to hide in the fortress, on which they erected ladders and tried to overcome it. They set fire to several buildings outside the walls. The Romans, who had been living in the fortress before, distraught by what was happening, had opened the gates earlier to take in their retreating soldiers. But when they saw that the barbarians were quickly approaching the fugitives, they were afraid that they might enter with them. So they quickly closed the gates, climbed onto the battlements, and threw down ropes with nooses, saving many people, including Cannon himself. The barbarians were about to take the fortress by force using the ladders they had raised against the walls, had it not been for two men who performed miracles, one of them being Belisarius' bodyguard, named Ulamon of Thrace, and the other being Valerian's bodyguard, the Message Bulgados. By chance, the two had recently arrived in Ancona. At this difficult moment, they cut down those who had climbed up with their swords and, to everyone's surprise, saved the fortress. Half dead themselves, with wounded bodies, they soon left. At that time, Belisarius was informed that Narses had arrived from Byzantium with a large army and had stopped at Picunum. Narses was a eunuch and guardian of the imperial treasures, a man with a sharp mind and very energetic, which is characteristic of eunuchs. Behind him came 5,000 soldiers, divided into detachments and with other commanders. Justin, the commander of the Illyrian troops, and another Narses, a fugitive from Armenia, who was subject to the Persians. He had long since become a true Roman with his brother Horatius, who had arrived shortly before with Belisarius. They were followed by 2,000 of the Heruli tribe, commanded by Vizend, Aluit, and Phanite. Now, I want to tell you what kind of tribe the Heruli were and where they came from as allies of the Romans. They had long lived beyond the Ister, worshipping many gods whom they considered worthy of human sacrifice. Many of their laws were unlike those of other peoples. They did not try to keep the elderly or the sick among the living. When they grew old or fell ill, they were obliged to ask to be killed as quickly as possible. Then his relatives would build a pyre of many logs and place the person on top, then send a stranger to stab him with a knife. It is assumed that the killer was not a relative. When the killer returned to them, they would go and light the pyre from the bottom. When the fire died down, they gathered the bones and buried them immediately. After an Herul died, if his wife wished to show high morality and glory, she could hang herself on his grave as soon as possible. If she did not do so, the woman was considered disgraced and the man's relatives isolated her. Such are the customs of the Heruls in ancient times. Over time, they grew stronger and multiplied, attacking their neighbors individually and naturally defeating them, raping them, and robbing them. Finally, they subjugated the Lombards, who had already become Christians as well as other tribes, and forced them to pay taxes, something unusual for these barbarians, driven by greed and murderous passions. When Anastasius ascended the throne of the Roman emperors, the Heruls, having no one to fight against, laid down their arms, became peaceful, and lived in peace for 3 years. When they became very angry with their leader Rodulf, they came to him and insulted him, saying that he had become effeminate like a woman, calling him all sorts of derogatory names and defending him. Painfully enduring their insults, Rodulf attacked the Lombards, who had done nothing to him, nor could he accuse them of any fault or breach of contract, but started a war with them for no reason. When the hand-to-hand combat began, many of the Herulians died, Rodulf himself died, and all the rest fled, forgetting all about bravery. In the pursuit, most of the Herulians died, only a few escaped. Since they no longer lived according to the customs of their ancestors, they left their homes as quickly as possible and traveled for a long time with all their women and children across the land beyond the Ister. When they reached the lands where the Rhogians had previously lived, who had united with the Goths and left for Italy, they settled there. But due to the famine that had struck these desolate lands, they soon rose up and approached the Gepids. At first, the Gepids agreed to let them settle in their neighborhood, but later, without any reason, they began to commit acts of lawlessness. They raped their women and stole their livestock and other property. They did not stop at any injustice. When they could no longer endure it, the heralds crossed the Ister River and wanted to settle near the Romans. At that time, Emperor Anastasius was on the throne, and he welcomed them hospitably and gave them permission to settle. However, it was not long before these barbarians began to commit godless acts against the local Romans. Therefore, the emperor sent troops against them. Having won the victory, the Romans killed most of them, although they could have destroyed them all. The survivors begged the generals to spare their lives and promised to become subjects of the emperor and his servants. When this was reported to Anastasius, he gave his consent, and thus the remnants of the heralds were saved, but they neither became allies of the Romans, nor did they do any good deeds. When Justinian became emperor, he gave them beautiful land and all sorts of other things, trying in every way to assimilate them, and succeeded in making them all Christians. But even in this case, they were not always loyal allies. Out of greed, they often committed acts of violence against their neighbors without any shame. They engaged in ungodly relations with goats and men, and as the worst of people, they were doomed to disappear in disgrace. Subsequently, a few of them, having concluded a treaty with the Romans, remained to live here, while the rest renounced this alliance. They killed their leader Oho without any reason. Having committed this crime, they immediately repented. They began to say that they could not live in anarchy without leaders. After many consultations, they decided that it would be best to send for a leader from the royal family on the island of Thule. I will now explain why. When the Heruli were defeated by the Lombards, as was customary, they withdrew from the lands of their ancestors, some settling in the lands of the Illyrians, while others did not want to cross the Ister and settled at the end of the world. Led by many chiefs of royal blood, they first passed through all the tribes of the Sclavini, Slavs. Then, after crossing a barren land, they reached the country of the so-called Varna. Then they traveled through the tribe of the Dani without being molested by these barbarians. Then they reached the ocean and, having crossed it by ship, landed on the island of Thule III and stayed there. The island of Thule was very large. They thought it was 10 times larger than Britain. It is located far to the north. Most of the land on this island is barren, and the inhabited land is populated by 13 large tribes. Each tribe had its own king. Strange things happen in this place every year. Around the summer solstice, the sun did not set for 40 days and shone constantly over the land. But after about 6 months, during the winter solstice, the sun does not appear for 40 days and the island is plunged into complete darkness. During this time, the people sink into complete despair and, since they have no way of interacting with each other, they do not move at all. Personally, I was unable to go to this island to see for myself what they told me, no matter how hard I tried. I asked some people who came from there how they kept track of the days and nights, since the sun did not rise and set at specific times. And they answered me logically and convincingly. During those 40 days when the sun does not rise, as mentioned above, people notice its glow sometimes in the east, sometimes in the west. And whenever the glow reappears in its previous place, they count that a day has passed. And when the season of long nights arrives, they calculate the days by following the path of the moon and the movement of the stars. When 35 days of this period of continuous night had passed, they sent special people to the top of the mountain, and when they saw the sun appear, they informed the people below that the sun would rise in 5 days. And the people, still in darkness, began their greatest celebration. For the inhabitants of Thule, this is the biggest holiday. It seems to me that these islanders live in constant fear that the sun will leave them forever, even though this happens every year. Among the barbarians who have settled in Thule, there is a tribe called the Scritifini who lead the wildest lifestyle. They wear no clothes, go barefoot, drink no wine, and harvest nothing from the land. They do not cultivate the land, nor do their women work, but the men and women hunt together. The dense forests and gentle mountains are full of beasts and other large wild animals. They feed on the meat of the animals they catch, dress in their skins, And since they have neither flax nor needles to sew, they use the veins of the beast to connect the skins to each other, and thus clothe their bodies. And the people there do not marry as other people do. The babies of the Scritophanes are not breastfed, but fed only the brains of the animals they catch. Immediately after giving birth, the woman ties the baby in an animal skin to a tree, puts an animal brain in its mouth, and goes back to her usual hunting. They always do this together with their husbands. Such is the way of life of these barbarians. But some other inhabitants of Thule are not very different from other people. They worship many gods and demons inhabiting the air, the earth, and the seas, as well as some other spirits, to whom they name springs and rivers. They constantly make sacrifices to the dead and to heroes. They consider the first man they capture to be the best sacrifice. They sacrifice him to Ares, whom they worship as the greatest. They perform sacred rites with the captive, not simply killing him, but hanging him on a stake or throwing him on sharp blades, or in some other way that arouses pity. Such is the life of the people of Thule. The most populous of these are the Gavdi tribe, alongside whom the Heruli who came here settled. And so the Heruli, who lived in the Roman lands, having killed their king, sent some of their nobles to the island of Thule to seek and bring back someone of royal descent. When these people arrived on the island, they found many people of royal blood. They chose the one they liked best and set off back with him. But when they arrived in Denmark, he died of illness. So they returned to the island and took another man with them, named Theoderic, along with his brother Ord and 200 young men from the Heruli of Thule. And since this journey took quite some time, it occurred to the Heruls living around Singidunum that they might harm themselves if they brought a king from Thule without Justinian's consent. Therefore, through an embassy to Byzantium, they asked the Belisarius to appoint a king of their choice. And he immediately sent them a king, one of the Heruli who had long lived in the capital, named Svarthus. At first, the Heruli obeyed and trusted the king who had been sent. But after a few days, news came from the people sent to the island of Thule that they were nearby. Svarthus ordered them to attack the approaching army and kill them, and the Heruls accepted the plan and immediately set off. When they were a day's journey away from each other, they abandoned him during the night and went over to the side of the approaching army, while he, left alone, fled to Byzantium. The emperor tried by all means to restore the previous situation. Therefore, the Heruli, frightened by the power of the Romans, defected to the Gepids. This was the reason for the separation of the Heruli. The Romans were quite angry that they had to maintain the siege for so long, wondering how the barbarians could withstand this calamity and not surrender. Therefore, Belisarius wanted to investigate how the barbarians were enduring this situation so patiently and hoped to capture a notable barbarian. Valerian promised him that he would find an easy solution. Among his people were men from the Sclavini tribe who knew how to hide even behind small stones or behind a bush, for where they would jump out and grab their enemies. They often did this near the river Ister, where they lived among both Romans and other foreigners. Belisarius was impressed by his words and wanted to get started right away. Valerian picked one of his Slavs who was really big and super energetic and sent him to bring back an enemy warrior alive, promising him a generous reward for Belisarius. The man replied that he would easily accomplish this where grass grew. Due to the famine, the Goths had long since begun to eat it, and the Slav, crawling early in the morning, hid among the bushes and the grass near the walls. As day broke, a Goth arrived to mow the grass, expecting no danger from the bushes, but looking frequently toward the enemy camp to see if anyone was coming from there. Jumping out suddenly from behind him, the Slav grabbed him and, clasping his arms tightly around his body, brought him to the camp and handed him over to Valerian. There was a certain Hilbudius, close to the imperial court, very energetic in military affairs, and so averse to greed that instead of amassing great wealth, he acquired nothing. In his 4th year of autocracy, the Belisarius appointed this Hilbudius as strategos of Thrace, putting him in charge of guarding the river Ister to prevent any of the barbarians from crossing it, because it was often crossed by the Huns, the Ants, and the Sclavini, causing irreparable damage to the Romans. Hilbudius proved so formidable to the barbarians that during the 3 years he was commander of the army, none of them dared to cross the Ister and fight the Romans. But the Romans themselves, under Hilbudius' leadership, often crossed the river, attacked, and enslaved the barbarians living there. In the 3rd year of his appointment, Hilbudius crossed the river in the usual manner with a small detachment, but the Slavs rose up against him en masse. The battle was fierce. Many Romans fell, including Hilbudius himself. After that, the river became permanently accessible to the barbarians, and the Roman territory was open to their attacks whenever they chose. It turns out that the power of the Roman state in this matter cannot be equaled by the valor of a single man. But soon after, the ants and the Slavs quarreled among themselves, and in the struggle, the ants were defeated by their opponents. In this battle, a Slav captured an enemy, still a young man, named Hilbudi, and took him to his home. Over time, Hilbudi proved to be very loyal to his master and showed himself to be very energetic in military matters. Many times he was put in dangerous situations by his master, performed many feats, and became very famous. At the same time, the ants attacked the Thracian villages, plundered many of them, and enslaved many of the local Romans. Pursuing them, they returned to their homeland. One of these captives was sent by fate to a humane and merciful master. He himself was a great villain and was capable of deceiving anyone he met. Finding no means to return to Roman soil, he devised the following plan. Going to his master, he showered him with praise for his mercy, for which God would reward him with many blessings, that he would never be ungrateful to his humane master, and that if the master would listen to his well-considered advice, he would soon acquire a great deal of money. In a Slavic tribe, there was a slave named Hilbudius, a Roman general who hid his identity from all the barbarians. If he decided to buy Hilbudius and take him to Roman territory, he would gain great glory and a great deal of money from the emperor. With these words, the Roman convinced his master, and together they set off for the Slavs. Peace was made between these peoples, and they communicated freely with each other. And so, offering a lot of money to Hilbudius' master, they bought this man and returned home. When they returned to their seats, the buyer began to question him, asking if it was true that he was the Roman general Hilbudius. He did not refuse to tell him everything as it was, completely openly recounting his life, that he was of ant origin and, together with his compatriots, had fought against the Slavs, who were then their enemies, and now that he had returned to his homeland, he should be freed by law. His buyer, who had paid so much money, was astonished and speechless, losing hope of success. But the Roman, in order to hide the truth and not complicate his return home, began to comfort him and claim that this was the same Hilbudius. But while he was among the barbarians, he was afraid to reveal the whole truth. But when he was on Roman soil, he would not only reveal the truth, but would also naturally be proud of his name. At first, this happened in secret from the other barbarians. But after the rumor began to spread everywhere, almost all the ants gathered around this case, which they considered common to all, believing that it would be of great benefit to them that they had already become masters of the Roman general Hilbudius. These tribes, the Slavs and the ants, are not ruled by one person, but have lived in democracy since ancient times. So for them, both successes and difficulties are accepted as common causes. Everything else among these barbarian tribes, such as their way of life and laws, is the same. They recognize only one God, the creator of lightning, as their master, and only to him do they offer sacrificial bulls and all sacred rites. They know nothing of fate and do not recognize that it has any significance for people. And when death threatens them due to illness or the danger of war, they promise that if they are saved, they will immediately offer a sacrifice to the god to save their souls. And if they happen to be saved, they immediately offer the sacrifice they promised, believing that their salvation came about because of this sacrifice. They worship rivers and nymphs and other similar demons, offering sacrifices to all of them and performing divinations on these sacrificial animals. They live in pitiful huts scattered far apart from each other, and they all frequently change their places of residence. In battle against their enemies, they appear as infantrymen with shields and spears in their hands, never wearing armor. Some wear neither tunics nor cloaks, but only wide garments fastened around the waist and groin, and in this guise they go out to battle. Both groups speak the same completely barbaric language, nor do they differ from each other in appearance. They are all very tall and extremely strong, and the color of their skin and hair is very white or blonde, so it is impossible for them to darken completely to black, but only to dark red. Their way of life is rough and without comforts, like that of the massage day. They're always in the filthiest conditions. They're undoubtedly cunning and treacherous when someone encounters them, and they have preserved the pure Hunnic customs. Even the names of their slaves and enemies were once the same. They used to be called a scattered people, I think because they lived in scattered settlements throughout the country. That is why they need more land, and they inhabit most of the space beyond the Ister. I think I have said little about them. When they gathered, as mentioned above, the ants forced this man to admit what they wanted him to say, that he was the Roman general Hilbudius. They threatened to punish him if he refused. At the same time that this was happening, the Emperor Justinian sent envoys to these barbarians with a proposal that they settle near the ancient city of Thrace, which lies on the river Ister. The city had been built by Emperor Trajan, but had been abandoned for many years and had long been deserted due to the plundering of the local barbarians. Emperor Justinian decided to give them this city and the surrounding lands, which had long been Roman property, promising that he would live with them and protect the peace in every way, that he would give them many resources, only if in the future they swore an oath to observe the peace and stand against the Huns when they attacked the Roman state. The barbarians listened to this, agreed, and promised to do all this if he reinstated the Roman general Hilbudius as their leader and allowed him to live with them as they wished, claiming that this was Hilbudius. Hoping to take up such a high position, he himself confirmed that he was the Roman general Hilbudius. Sent to Byzantium for this purpose, he was arrested by Narses, meeting him and seeing that he was a fraud. Although he knew Latin and pretended skillfully, having already learned how Hilbudius should look, he imprisoned him and forced him to confess everything. At the same time, the Slavic army, after crossing the Ister, ravaged the whole of Illyria as far as Epidamnus, killing and enslaving all those they met on their way and plundering all their property. Even many fortresses, which in the past had seemed secure and therefore no one had defended them, were captured. The surrounding area was carefully searched and all property was plundered. The commanders in Illyria followed them with an army of 15,000, but nowhere did they dare to approach the enemies. Then, in Byzantium and other places during the winter season, there were many unusually strong earthquakes, mainly at night. The inhabitants of these places were greatly afraid of being buried, but nothing serious happened to them. At the same time, the Nile rose 18 cubits, flooding and inundating all of Egypt. But while in Upper Thebes the water began to recede into its bed at the appropriate time, and the people there began to sow and engage in other cultivation of the land, the lower part of the country remained flooded. The water did not drain away during the entire sowing period, which had never happened before and caused such disasters. And not long after, when the water finally receded and the seeds were sown, the water came again and rotted all the crops that had been planted up to that point. Due to these unusual events, the people fell into great distress and helplessness, and many of the animals died from lack of food. Then the Byzantines caught this whale, which they called Porphyrius. This whale had been a nuisance to Byzantium and the surrounding area for more than 50 years, but in truth it did so rarely over a long period of time, but it sank many ships, causing many passengers to disappear, and when it attacked them, it scattered them far and wide. Therefore, Emperor Justinian wanted very much to capture this monster, but his desire could not be fulfilled in any way. How they managed to catch it, I will now tell you. The sea happened to be absolutely calm when a large pod of dolphins was swimming near the entrance to the Euxine Sea. At the sudden appearance of the monster, they scattered as fast as they could, and most of them headed for the mouth of the Sangarita River. Having managed to catch a few, the whale immediately swallowed them. Then, whether because of its greed or its passion for victory, it continued to chase them until it suddenly found itself almost at the shore. Here it got stuck in deep mud, and no matter how frantically it flapped and jumped to free itself from the spot, it could not free itself from the shallows and sank even deeper into the mud. Word of the incident spread quickly among the local residents, who immediately arrived, began cutting it up everywhere with various axes, and pulled it ashore with ropes. When they loaded it onto carts, they found that the whale was 30 cubits long and 10 cubits thick. After cutting it up and dividing it into pieces, some people ate their share immediately, while others decided to salt their portion. In connection with the earthquakes, the flooding of the Nile, and the incident with the whale, the Byzantines began to speculate about whatever they wanted. At that time, the army of the Clavans, which numbered no more than 3,000 men, crossed the river Ister and, without encountering anyone, then crossed the river Hebrus without any difficulty and divided into two. One part consisted of 1,800 men and the other of the rest. The commanders of the Roman army in Thrace and Illyria engaged in hand-to-hand combat with this army. And although the Slavic troops were divided, the Romans were defeated due to a sudden attack from two sides. Some of the Romans were killed, while others escaped. After the Roman generals were defeated in this way by the barbarian army, even though it was much smaller, one of the enemy troops engaged in battle with Aspad. He was one of Justinian's bodyguards, a member of the so-called candidates, commanding a cavalry that had long been stationed in the Thracian fortress of Gerulus and had a large and well-trained contingent. The Slavs easily put them to flight, during which they killed most of the shamefully fleeing, captured Aspad alive, and then threw him into a burning fire and burned him, after first stripping the skin from his back. After that, they began to plunder all the settlements in Thrace and Illyria unhindered, and both detachments captured many fortresses by siege, whereas before they could not capture fortresses, nor did they have the courage to go out into open battle, because these barbarians never dared to cross Roman territory. In fact, it seems that they crossed the river Ister only once with their army, as I mentioned earlier. These Slavs who defeated Aspad plundered everything as far as the sea and even captured the fortress of the coastal city of Topher, even though it had a garrison. This city is the first on the Thracian coast and is 12 days' journey from Byzantium. They captured the city in the following manner. Most of them hid in hard-to-reach places in the vicinity, while the few who appeared before the eastern gates began to provoke the Romans who were on the walls. The soldiers of the garrison thought that the enemies were no more than those who were visible, grabbed their weapons, and all went out against them. The barbarians turned back, pretending to be frightened by their attack, and fled. The Romans, carried away by the pursuit, found themselves far away in the countryside, whereupon those lying in ambush rose up and cut off their retreat to the city. Those who had pretended to flee stopped and turned against the Romans, and they found themselves caught between two fires. The barbarians destroyed everyone and then rushed against the walls. The inhabitants of the city, left without the protection of the military, found themselves in great distress and began to defend themselves against the attackers. First, they began to pour boiling oil and tar on those who were climbing the walls, and everyone threw reeds at them, but they did not defend themselves for long against the impending danger. After showering the defenders with clouds of arrows, the barbarians forced them to retreat from the battlements, raised ladders against the walls, and captured the city. They immediately killed up to 15,000 men, plundered all the property, and enslaved the women and children. From the beginning, they did not take into account any age or status. Since they invaded the Roman lands, they killed everyone who crossed their path, so that the whole land of Illyria and Thrace was filled with unburied corpses. They killed those who crossed their path not with swords, not with spears, nor in any usual way, but by driving stakes firmly into the ground, sharpening them to the maximum, and impaled the unfortunate victims on them with great force, so that the sharp point entered behind their weak points and, due to the weight of the body, penetrated to the middle of their entrails. This is how they treated them. Sometimes these barbarians drove 4 thick stakes deep into the ground, tied the hands and feet of their captives to them, and then beat them continuously with sticks on the head until they killed them like a dog, snake, or other beast. Others locked them in some rooms together with cattle and sheep that they could not take back to their native places and burned them mercilessly. Thus, the slaves destroyed all the people they came across. But now they and those from the other detachment, as if intoxicated by a sea of blood, began to capture some of those who fell into their hands, taking tens of thousands with them when they all returned to their native places. 40. While Germanus was gathering troops in Serdica, a city in Illyria, and making them combat-ready, equipping them with everything necessary for war, a huge mass of Slavs, greater than ever before, appeared on Roman soil. They crossed the river Ister and arrived near Nisus. When a few of them separated from the main army and began to roam these places individually, some of the Romans captured them, tied them up, and began to interrogate them about why this army of Slavs had crossed the Ister and what they intended to do. They revealed that their intention was to besiege and capture Thessaloniki and the cities around it. When the emperor heard about this, he was greatly alarmed and immediately wrote an order to Germanos to postpone the campaign to Italy, to take up the defense of Thessaloniki and the surrounding cities, and to stop the invasion of the Slavs as far as he could. So Germanos lingered here. When the Slavs arrived, they learned from captives that Germanos was in Sardica and became alarmed. Among these barbarians, Germanus' name was well known for the following reason. When Justinian, Germanus' uncle, ascended to the throne as emperor, the ants, the closest neighbors of the Slavs, crossed the Ister and invaded Roman territory with a large army. It so happened that shortly before that, the emperor had appointed Germanus as commander of the troops in Thrace. Germanus engaged the enemy in battle and inflicted a great defeat on them, killing almost all of them. And because of this, Germanus gained great fame among all people, especially among these barbarians. Frightened by him, as I said, and assuming that he had been sent by the emperor against Attila and the Goths and had great forces at his disposal, the Slavs immediately stopped their campaign against Thessaloniki, did not dare to descend further into the field, and, crossing all the mountains in Illyria, found themselves in Dalmatia. With this concern removed, Germanus ordered the army to prepare to set out for Italy in 2 days. But misfortune overtook him. He suddenly fell ill and his life was cut short. And so Germanus died, a brave man, very energetic, an excellent general, independent, an excellent organizer, and in times of peace and happy circumstances, he managed to firmly defend the law and order in state life. He was the most just judge. When he ruled on all poor people, he did not take much money, and without any interest, he behaved most strictly in the palace and in the square. At home, he was friendly, frank, and cheerful. He did not participate in any conspiracies of the parties in Byzantium. He did not exchange a word with them, while many of the powerful were involved in such nonsense. John arrived in Dalmatia with the imperial army and decided to spend the winter in Ceylon, and after the winter to go straight to Ravenna. At that time, the Slavs, who had previously been in the possession of the Belisarius, as I have just recounted, and others who crossed the Ister shortly thereafter and joined the first group, were able to invade the Roman Empire unhindered. Many suspected that Attila had bribed these barbarians with a lot of money and sent them against the Romans so that the Belisarius could not wage war against the Goths while he was busy dealing with these barbarians. I cannot say whether the Slavs acted in accordance with Attila's wishes or on their own initiative, without anyone calling them. Dividing themselves into 3 parts, these barbarians caused great harm to the whole of Europe, plundering these lands not on a campaign, but by staying there for the winter without encountering any opposition. Later, The Emperor Justinian sent a defensive army against them, commanded by Constantine, Arados, Nazars, Justin, the son of Germanos, and John, who was also called Fagin. He placed Scholasticus, a court eunuch, at the head of them all. This army captured some of the barbarians near the city of Adrianople, which lies in the middle of Thrace, 5 days' journey from Byzantium. The barbarians could not continue further because they were carrying with them people, animals, and countless riches of all kinds. Having stopped there, they decided to engage in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy, but they intended to do so in such a way that the enemy would not understand what they were actually doing. The Slavs set up their camp on a hill, and the Romans not far from them, down in the fields. Much time had passed since they had taken up positions opposite each other when the Roman soldiers began to get nervous, to do unacceptable things, to reproach the commanders that as leaders of the Roman army, they had plenty of provisions and were not interested in the soldiers, who were experiencing shortages of basic necessities and did not want to engage in hand-to-hand combat with the enemy. Because of them, the commanders began an offensive, and a terrible battle ensued, in which the Romans were crushed to dust. Many good soldiers died here, and the generals, who were in danger of being captured by the enemy, barely managed to escape as quickly as possible with the remnants of the army. The barbarians captured Constantine's banner and, paying no attention to the Roman army, continued forward. They had the opportunity to plunder the entire region called Astica, which had not been plundered since ancient times, so they took great spoils. In this way, having devastated the entire region, the barbarians reached the Long Wall, which was a day's journey before Byzantium. Shortly thereafter, the Roman army, which had been following the barbarians, unexpectedly attacked them and, after putting them to flight, captured some of them. They killed many of their enemies, managed to rescue many of the captured Romans, recovered Constantine's banner, and all the remaining barbarians returned to their homeland along with all the remaining spoils. In my previous books, I recounted everything that happened up to the 4th year of the 5-year truce that was concluded between the Romans and the Persians. In the following year, a large Median, Persian, army invaded Caucasus. It was led by a Persian named Chorianes, a very experienced man in military affairs. As his allies, he was followed by the barbarians of the Alani tribe. When this army entered the region of Lazica, called Moharesis, they set up a convenient camp. There flows the river Hypanis, which is not large and not navigable, and therefore accessible to both cavalry and infantry. They set up a fortified camp on its right side, but not on the shore itself, but at a great distance, so that readers of these lines may clearly imagine for themselves all the localities of the Lazians and what other tribes live in this country, and so that readers are not forced to listen to these stories as if they were fighting some kind of shadows. I have decided to describe in this part of my book how and what kind of people live along this so-called Euxine Sea. I am well aware that more ancient writers have written about all this, but I still think that what they have said is not entirely accurate. Some of them called the Sanites Lazians, whom we now call Zani or Colchians, while others call them Lazians, a name that is still used today. In fact, neither is true. The Zani are located far from the sea coast, living together with the Armenians in the middle of the continent, and between them rise high mountains, impassable and completely steep. The country is completely uninhabited, and the ravines of the small rivers, which are difficult for a person to climb, are covered with dense forests. All this separates the Zani from the sea and does not make them a coastal people. The Colchians, who are now Lazians, live along the river faces. They have only changed their name from Colchians to Lazians, something that is common to many other tribes. This Pontus begins at Byzantium and Chalcedon, and ends at the land of the Colchians. Sailing along its right bank, one finds the Vitini, followed by the Honoriates and the Paphlagonians, who, in addition to the cities of Heraclea and Amastris, also have other coastal villages. Next come the so-called Pontians, all the way to the city of Trebizond and its borders. Further on are coastal settlements, including Sinope and Amisos, and near Amisos is the so-called Themysciran and the river Thermodon, where, as they say, the camp of the Amazons was located. I will write a little more about the Amazons later. The borders of the Trapezuundians extend to the villages of Suserman and Rise, which are 2 days' journey from Trapezuund along the coast in the direction of Lazica. The honey in the areas around Trebizond is bitter, thus refuting the common opinion that honey is sweet only here. To the right of this region, the mountains of the Zani rise everywhere, and beyond them are the Armenians, who are subjects of the Romans. From these mountains of the Zani flows a river called Boas, which runs through densely overgrown hilly areas very close to the lands of the Lazians and flows into the Euxine Sea, but no longer under the name Voas. The locals call it a campsus because when it reaches the sea, it does not change its course, but flows with such power and speed that it forms a strong current and waves inland, making these places inaccessible to navigation. For this reason, those who sail in this part of the Pontus sail almost in the middle of the sea, and only in this way can they escape the strong current of the river. It is said that during the time of the Roman Emperor Trajan, Roman troops camped here near the lands of the Lazians and Sagids. But the people here are subjects neither of the kings of Rome nor of Lazica. It is true that they are Christians, and the Lazian bishops appoint their priests. These tribes are friends to both sides of their own free will, and they have agreed to always accompany envoys from one side to the other. Obviously, they still do so today. The messengers sent by the two rulers to each other are transported by their boats. Until now, they have not paid taxes to anyone. From these places, very steep mountains rise straight up, followed by large deserted spaces. Beyond them live the so-called Persians and Armenians, who are subjects of Rome and extend to the borders of Iberia. From the city of Absarunt to the city of Petra and the borders of the Lazians, where the Euxine Sea ends, it is a day's journey. Upon reaching these places, Pontus forms a crescent shape with the coast. The length of the road along this crescent-shaped bay is about 550 stadia, and everything that lies on this coast is called Lazica. Inland behind them lie the regions of Skimnia and Swania. These tribes are subject to the Lazians. In the lands bordering this country, as far as Iberia itself, live the Meschites, who have long been subjects of the Iberians. They live in the mountains, but the mountains of the Meschites are not rocky, but fertile. On the contrary, they abound in goods, since the Meschites are skilled farmers and winemakers. In this country, there are very high mountains. Through these mountains, towering high into the sky, flows the river Phasis, which starts in the Caucasus Mountains and descends to the bay in the shape of a crescent, flowing into the Pontus. Some believe that at this point the river Phasis serves as the border between two continents. The places on the left bank of the river are considered to be Asia, while those on the right represent Europe. All the settlements of the Lazians are located in the European part, while on the other side the Lazians have neither cities nor fortresses, unless we consider that the Romans once built the city of Petra here. According to local legends, the Golden Fleece was located in this part of Lazica, which is why poets in their myths had the Greeks build the ship Argo. But my opinion on this is that it is completely untrue. There is no way that Jason and Medea could have taken the Golden Fleece and secretly escaped from Et. The Caucasus mountain range rises above this country. The Caucasus mountains are so high that neither rain nor snowfall can reach their peaks. They are higher than any clouds. The branches of the Caucasus mountains in the northwest reach Illyria and Thrace, and those in the southeast reach the passes through which the Hunnic tribes living there cross into the territories of the Persians and Romans. One of these passes is called Tsur, and the other has been called the Caspian Gate since ancient times. The entire region, which begins in the Caucasus Mountains and reaches the Caspian Gate, belongs to the Alans, a free people who are often allies of the Persians in their campaigns against the Romans and other enemies. The Huns, called Saberi, as well as other Hun tribes, live here. It is said that the Amazons originated from here, who set up their camp near Themyscira on the Thermodon River, which I mentioned above, and where the city of Amisos is now located. Nowadays, there is no trace or mention of the Amazons anywhere in the Caucasus region, even though Strabo and other writers have written extensively about them. They say that a huge army of barbarians with their women set out from these places to Asia, and, having set up camp near the Thermodon River, the barbarian men left their women and went to Rome, plunder, and ravage much of Asia. When the local peoples rose up against them, they were all killed, and not a single man returned to the camp to his wife. So these women, influenced by fear of the people around them and forced by a lack of food, had to take on a masculine appearance, donning the weapons and armor of their men who had remained in the camp. Thus armed, they performed many brave deeds, driven by necessity. This continued until all of them perished. And I think that the Amazons accompanied their men on their campaigns, based on what could be observed today. The customs passed down to their descendants come from the nature and customs of their ancestors. The Huns attacked the Roman Empire more than once and got into hand-to-hand combat with those who came out against them. And of course, some of them got killed here. After the barbarians retreated, when examining the bodies, the Romans found women among them. And so, as far as is known, nowhere in the world has a female army been encountered, neither in Asia nor in Europe. Nowhere in the Caucasus Mountains has there been a shortage of male population. So much for the Amazons. After the Apicilians, and after the second end of the crescent-shaped bay, the Abazgi live on the coast, whose territory reaches the Caucasus Mountains. The Abazgi have long been subjects of the Lazians and have always had two leaders from among their tribesmen. One was the ruler of the west, the other of the east. These barbarians, even in my time, worshipped sacred groves in the forests. With their barbaric naivety, they considered trees to be gods. Because of their greed for silver, they suffered greatly at the hands of their rulers. The thing is, these two kings, without any qualms, took beautiful and well-built kids from their parents, made them eunuchs, and sold them in the Roman Empire to whoever offered the most money. Their fathers were immediately killed so that they could not later take revenge for the injustice done to their children, nor for their death. Thus, most of the eunuchs among the Romans were of Abbasid descent. Now, during the reign of Justinian, all the rules among the Abbastians have been relaxed. They accepted Christianity, and the Emperor Justinian sent a eunuch from the royal court, a native of the Abbasti named Euphrates, who strictly forbade their kings in the future to deprive any one of their people of their manhood by forcing their nature with iron. The Abbastians breathed a sigh of relief at this command of the emperor. Then the Belisarius Justinian erected a temple to the Mother of God among the Abbasti, brought priests to it, so that they might all accept the Christian way of life, and soon after that the Abbasti dethroned their two kings and wished to live freely. Beyond the borders of the Abasti in the Caucasus Mountains live the Heruli, located between the Abasti and the Alans. And along the Euxine Sea, the Zahidi have settled. Some time ago, the Roman emperor appointed a king over these Zeki, but now these barbarians obeyed nothing from the Romans. After them lived the Sagids, whose coastal part was under Roman rule in the past. To frighten them, the Romans built two coastal fortresses, Sevastopol and Pityant, 2 days' journey apart, and from the very beginning they had garrisons there. When the Persian king Khosrow was summoned by the Lazians in Petra, he wanted very much to send troops to conquer these fortresses. When the Roman soldiers learned of this in time, they burned the residential buildings, destroyed the walls to their foundations, and without delay boarded ships, sailed to the opposite mainland, and arrived in Trebizond. After the sagas, many Hunnic tribes settled there. The country stretching there is called Evisia. Its barbarians occupied both the coast and the interior, all the way to the so-called Meotian Lake and the Tanais River, which flows into the lake. This lake flows into the Euxine Sea. The people who lived here in ancient times were called Cimmerians, and now they are called Utigurs. Further north of them live the countless tribes of the Ants. Up to these lands, where the mouth of the lake begins, lived the so-called Goths Tetraxites, who are not many, and who respectfully observe the Christian canons no worse than others. The local people call Tanais this estuary, which begins at Meotida and extends all the way to the Euxine Sea, stretching, as they say, for 20 days' journey. The wind that blows there is also called Tanais. Once upon a time, these Goths, like all Gothic tribes, belonged to the Arian faith or believed in some other doctrine, about which I can say nothing, nor can they say anything, nor do they think about it. But now they honor their faith with spiritual simplicity and reverence. Recently, when 21 years of Justinian's reign had passed, they sent 4 envoys to Byzantium to ask for a bishop, because the one who had been their priest had recently died, and they had learned that the Belisarius had sent a priest to the Abashti. The emperor readily granted their request and sent them away. Since it was clear that these envoys feared the Huns, and there were many witnesses, they declared what they had come for and said nothing else to the emperor except to send them a priest, but in secret and in whispers to those closest to him. They whispered how beneficial it would be for the Roman Empire if their neighboring barbarians were in constant strife with each other. How and where the Tetraxites settled here, I will now tell you. In ancient times, the Huns, when they were called Cimmerians, in great numbers seized the places I mentioned and were ruled by one king. And while he held power, 2 boys were born to him, one named Euturger and the other Keturger. Then, when their father died, the 2 divided the state between themselves and gave their names to those they ruled. Thus, in my time, they are called Euturgers and Keturgers. They all lived in the same place, had the same way of life in everything, and did not mix with the other people who lived across the lake and its mouth, because they had never crossed the water, nor did they suspect that it could be crossed. They were so afraid of this simplest of things that they never even attempted to do it, and never thought of crossing over. Right on the far side of Lake Meotis, and its mouth had been inhabited since ancient times by the so-called Gothic Tetraxites, whom I have already mentioned. Far from them, the Goths, Visigoths, Vandals, and other Gothic tribes inhabited everything. In earlier times, they were also called Scythians because all the tribes that inhabited these areas were called by the common name Scythian. Some of them were called Soromatians or Melanchthani, or something else. According to an old legend, if it is true, several young Cimmerians who went hunting with dogs chased a deer, and it jumped into these waters. The young men, whether out of inexperience, ambition, or some desire for victory, or possessed by some demons, followed this deer, keeping up with it until they reached the opposite shore. And then the hunted game suddenly disappeared. It seems to me that it appeared for this purpose, to bring some misfortune to the barbarians living there. And the young men, unsuccessful in their hunt, found a reason for battle and plunder. Returning as quickly as possible, they announced to all the Cimmerians that these waters were easy to cross. They immediately grabbed their weapons, and without delay crossed over to the opposite mainland. And so the Cimmerians suddenly attacked the inhabitants of these fields, killed many of them, and put all the rest to flight. Those who managed to escape from them gathered together with all the children and women, abandoned their native places, crossed the river Ister, and found themselves within the borders of Rome. They caused a lot of trouble for the people living there, and later, with the permission of the emperor, they settled in the Thracian lands. On the one hand, they were allies of the Romans and, like other soldiers, received annual funds from the emperor to live on as federates. But on the other hand, they fought against the Romans without any reason on their part, until they left for Italy under the leadership of Theoderic. The Huns, as I said above, killed some and forced others to emigrate, and took over the country. Of them, the Keturgs, after taking their children and wives, moved there and settled permanently, and so it remains to this day. Although they received large gifts from the Belisarius every year, they crossed the river Ister and attacked the lands of the Belisarius, sometimes appearing as allies, sometimes as enemies of the Romans. The Euturgers, together with their leader, decided to return home to rule alone wherever they settled. Not far from Lake Meotia, they encountered the so-called Goths Tetrachites. At first, the Goths surrounded themselves with shields to defend themselves from their attackers. relying on their strength and the narrowness of the place, because they considered themselves the strongest barbarians there. In addition, the beginning of the mouth of Lake Meotia, where the Goth Tetrachites had settled, forms a crescent-shaped bay that surrounds them on almost all sides, leaving only one ver. Inaho passage. But subsequently, since the Huns did not want to waste time with them, nor did the Goths have any hope of successfully defending themselves against so many enemies, they began negotiations among themselves to unite their forces for joint campaigns downriver. The Goths decided to settle on the opposite side, right on the shore where they still live today, to remain friends and allies with the Utigurs in the future, and to live there forever with equal and identical rights. This is how the Goths settled here, and the Caturgs, as I've already said, remained beyond the lake, while the Utigurs remain alone to rule the country, without causing any difficulties for the Romans, because they were not in contact anywhere. Many tribes lived between them, and there was no way for them to engage in hostile actions against each other. Most of the lands beyond Lake Meotia and the Tanais River, as I said, were inhabited by the Huns Caturgs. Behind them, the whole land is inhabited by the Scythians and the Tauri, which is why this part is called Taurica, where they say a temple to Artemis was built, whose chief priestess was Iphigenia of Agamemnon. They say that the Armenians also had such a temple in the so-called Aquilicini region, and all the peoples there are called Scythians. After these tribes lies a coastal city called Bosporus, which until recently was under Roman rule. If one travels from Bosporus to the city of Cher-Sun, which lies on the seashore and has also been subject to the Romans since ancient times, the entire region between them is occupied by the barbarians of the Huns. There are also two settlements near Cher-Sun, called Kipi and Phaniguria, which have been under Roman rule since ancient times as well as in my time. But recently, the barbarians from the surrounding areas captured them and destroyed them to the ground. From the city of Cher-Sun to the mouth of the river Ister, also called the Danube, the journey takes 10 days, and the entire area is inhabited by barbarians. The river Ister flows from the mountains of the Celts, bypassing the border of Italy and flowing through the lands of the Dacians, Illyrians, and Thracians, and empties into the Euxine Sea. All of this, from there to Byzantium, is under Roman rule. This is the circumference of the Euxine Sea from Chalcedon to Byzantium. I cannot say exactly how long this circuit is because, as I said, these places are full of so many barbarians that the Romans have no contact with them, except for the embassies they send, and even those who have made measurements in the past have been unable to say anything precise. One thing can be said with certainty, that the right side of Pontus from Chalcedon to the river Phasis is 50 days' journey for a lightly laden man. Presumably, it could be said that the opposite side of Pontus is no less long than this. By chance, there were several barbarians from the tribe of the Sabaeans, in this Roman army. The Sabaeans, are a Hun people living around the Caucasus Mountains who were very numerous and naturally divided into many tribes. Some of their leaders have been friends with the Roman emperors since ancient times, while others have been friends with the Persian kings. Each of these rulers periodically paid his friend a certain amount of gold, but not every year, only when necessary. And then Emperor Justinian, in order to summon his friend from the Sabaeans, sent a man with money to him. Because of the enemies between them, crossing the Caucasus Mountains with so much money was very dangerous. So when that man arrived at the Roman camp at Bes, which was located near the siege of Petra, he sent people to the Sabaeans to tell them to come quickly and take the money he had brought. The barbarians chose 3 of their leaders with a small detachment and immediately sent them to Lazica. When they arrived there, they joined the Romans in the attack on the fortress of Petra. When they saw that the Romans did not know how to proceed with the capture of the fortress and were at a loss, the Sabers created a device that neither the Romans nor the Persians had ever thought of since the creation of the world, even though both countries, as well as this one, had always had a large number of engineers. Often throughout the centuries, both sides had used similar devices to destroy walls in steep and inaccessible places, but no one had ever had an idea like the one these barbarians had then. Over time, people come up with new ideas and new inventions for use. Then, these savages invented a battering ram, but not as it had been used before, but as an innovation in a different way. They did not put horizontal or vertical beams on this machine, but tied thick rods instead of beams everywhere. They covered the device with skins, preserving its ram shape, with ropes hanging freely in the middle as usual, and only one beam, sharpened and covered with iron at the front like a pointed arrow, so that they could often drive it into the wall. And they made this device so light that it did not need people inside it to pull or push it. Only 40 men were needed to lift and unhook the beam, ram the battering ram in the wall while standing inside the machine covered by skins, and easily carry this machine on their shoulders. These barbarians made 3 such machines, taking the beams with iron from the battering rams that the Romans had prepared but could not move onto the walls. Now 40 Roman soldiers, chosen from among the bravest, entered each machine and easily stuck these devices to the walls. On both sides of each device, other soldiers in armor stood, covering their heads very carefully with helmets, carrying ropes with iron hooks at the ends in their hands. This was done so that when the stones were shaken loose by the blows of the battering ram, they could hook the broken stones with these hooks and pull them out. The Romans began their work, and the wall began to shake from the frequent blows. Those standing on the side with the ropes and hooks hooked the stones that had been loosened from the wall and pulled them down, and it seemed that the city would fall. However, the Persians had another plan. They brought a wooden tower, which they had built in advance, close to the wall, and put their bravest men on it, who were dressed in armor and covered their heads and the rest of their bodies with iron nails. They filled vessels with sulfur, asphalt, and paint, which the Medes call naphtha and the Greeks call Medea's fire, and set them alight and poured them onto these machines with the battering rams, almost burning them completely. About 12,000 of their allies, the Huns, the so-called Savers, came with them. But Mermerius, who feared that with such a large number of barbarians, not only would they not voluntarily obey him, but they might also carry out some attacks on the Persian army, allowed only 4,000 to go on the campaign with him, and sent the rest back to their homeland, giving them a bunch of money. While all this was going on here, here's what happened in Europe. As I mentioned in my previous books, the Gepids made peace with the Lombards, who had been their enemies. But since they had not managed to resolve all their differences, they realized that it would not be long before they would have to fight each other again. And so, gathering all their forces, they set out against each other. Poricin led the Gepids, and Abduin led the Lombards. They were followed by several tens of thousands of soldiers. They were too close to each other, but they could not yet see each other. Suddenly, both sides were seized by so-called panic, which caused them to flee without any reason, leaving only their commanders with a few of their men. They concluded a 2-year truce, during which time they sent authorized envoys to each other, finally and clearly understood their differences, and resolved them. After failing to resolve their differences during this truce, they resorted to military action against each other again. Since the Gepids feared the Roman Empire, they believed it would help the Lombards. They decided to call on some of the Huns as their allies. They sent messengers to the leaders of the Kuturgs, who were then living on the other side of Lake Meotis, and asked them to join their side in the war against the Lombards. And they immediately sent them 12,000 men, commanded by Heniolos, a very experienced man in military affairs. However, the Gepids were disturbed by the presence of the arriving barbarians because the time for war had not yet come and there was still a year left of the truce, and they persuaded them during that time to attack the emperor's lands and turn the attack against the Romans into a way to get out of their predicament. Since the Romans vigilantly guarded the river Ister so that it would not be crossed and the lands of the Illyrians and Thracians would not be invaded, they brought these Huns to the opposite side of their territories and from there sent them against the Romans. And after they had ravaged almost all the settlements there, Emperor Justinian devised the following plan, sending people to the leaders of the Huns Utigurs, who lived beyond Lake Meotia. He accused them of reprehensible inaction towards the Kutigurs, saying that when they wanted to destroy their friends, This should be considered the most criminal thing. The Kütigers, he said, supposedly your closest neighbors, were completely reckless. Even though they received a lot of money from Byzantium every year, they made no effort to stop harming the Romans, and every day they attacked and robbed them for no reason. And since they did not gain anything and did not receive any of the Kütiger spoils, they did not stand up for the wronged Romans, even though they had been true friends with the Romans since ancient times. This is what Emperor Justinian said to the Kütigers, giving them money, reminding them how many gifts he had often given them before, and convincing them to immediately attack the Kütigers who had remained at home. Having summoned 2,000 allies from the neighboring Goths, known as the Tetraxites, they all crossed the Tanais River. They were led by Sandil, a very intelligent man, extremely skilled in military affairs, sufficiently brave and manly. As soon as they crossed the river, they were met by many Kütigers and hand-to-hand combat began. And since they defended themselves very bravely against the attackers, the battle dragged on for quite some time. But in the end, the Kütigers put their opponents to flight and killed many of them. Few managed to escape and save themselves as best they could. And the attackers, having enslaved the children and women, returned home. While these barbarians were fighting among themselves, as was inevitable, and the danger to them was obvious, the Romans were able to take advantage of their great luck. Those of them who happened to be captives of the Kütigers, several tens of thousands, as they say, were freed at that difficult moment, quickly left the place, and, without being pursued by anyone, returned to their homeland, thus taking advantage of the victory to achieve what they desired most. And the Emperor Justinian sent General Horatius to Hinulin and the other Huns, ordering him to tell them what had happened in their land, and, giving them money, persuaded them to leave the land of the Romans as quickly as possible. When they learned of the invasion of the Kütigers and received a large sum of money from Horatius, they agreed to stop killing, enslaving, and committing other evil deeds, but to withdraw as friends of the local people. They also agreed that if these barbarians managed to return to their homeland, they would settle there and remain loyal to the Romans. And if it was impossible for them to stay there, they would return to the land of the Romans, and the emperor would grant them some land in Thrace to settle there as allies of the Romans forever and ever, and together with them, to conscientiously defend the country from all foreigners. At the same time, 2,000 of these Huns, who had been defeated in battle and managed to escape from the Kütigers, came to the Roman Empire, followed by their children and wives. One of their leaders was Sinaon, who many years ago, together with Belisarius, had fought against Gelimer and the Vandals and turned to Emperor Justinian for protection. He accepted them with great satisfaction and ordered them to be settled in the lands of Thrace. However, Sandil, the king of the Kütigers, when he learned of these things, became very angry and enraged because these Kütigers, who were his kinsmen, had avenged the insults they had inflicted on the Romans and driven them from their homeland. Now the emperor had accepted them, and having settled in the Roman territories, they would live better. He sent envoys to the king to rebuke him for this action, without delivering any letter. Since the Huns were completely illiterate, they did not bother with this. They did not have any letters, nor did they make any effort to educate their children. These envoys, as is customary among barbarian peoples, had to convey verbally to the emperor what he had ordered them to say. And when they appeared before Emperor Justinian, they declared that instead of a letter, King Sandil would speak with their mouths. Since childhood, I have known a saying that I still remember, and if I have not forgotten anything, it goes as follows. They say that a wild wolf, although this is probably impossible, can change its coat, but cannot change its nature because its nature does not allow it. Here is what Sandil said, using the proverb, I have heard even the old people hint at human relationships with such mysterious words. I know something else that I have learned from personal experience, and that can be learned from any barbarian living in the countryside. Shepherds take dogs with them when they are still puppies and carefully raise them in their homes. Dogs are very grateful and loyal animals to those who feed them and are most memorable for the good that has been done to them. Shepherds do this so that if wolves approach the flock, these dogs will repel their attack, and become the protectors and saviors of the flock. And I think this is how it is done everywhere in the world. Nowhere has anyone seen dogs mistreating flocks or wolves ever protecting them. Nature has given dogs, sheep, and wolves distinct characters. So I think that even in your kingdom, where very different things happen, even the most bizarre, such changes cannot happen anywhere. Or show my messenger something similar, so that on the threshold of old age, I may learn something extraordinary. If things happen the same way everywhere, then you should not show hospitality to the Couture tribe, creating, as I think, such a suspicious neighborhood. Those whom you could not bear when they were far from your borders, you now want to make your compatriots. It won't be long before they show the Romans their habits. And even though they are not enemies, they will not stop harming the Roman Empire in the hope that, even if defeated, they will receive a better position from you than before. Furthermore, supposedly your friends, they will not stand by the Romans to repel those who want to attack you, for fear that if they do something brilliant according to fate, they will see those who are in a better position than themselves defeated. So are we, living in huts in a desolate and barren country, while these Couturers are given the opportunity to eat, drink wine, and choose all kinds of delicacies. They will even be able to bathe in baths. They will adorn themselves with gold and wear light, multicolored, and gold-threaded clothes. And these Couturers until recently took countless numbers of Romans into slavery in their lands. These criminals did not consider it unacceptable to demand slave labor from them. They took it for granted that they could be whipped without any guilt, killed, in a word, that the barbarian master could do whatever he wanted according to his character and desires. With our labor and at great risk to ourselves, risking our own lives, we rescued your compatriots from their fate and returned them to their parents. These were the people for whom we endured all the hardships of war. And now, in response to our actions and the attitude of these criminals towards you, you have done exactly the opposite of what we deserve. We continue to live in our former and inherited poverty, while they have divided their possessions equally among those who escaped slavery with them, saved by our valor. This is what the envoys of the Couturers said. The emperor honored them in every way and gave them rich gifts, but soon sent them back. This is what happened then. At the same time, the Varna tribe and the island warriors who lived on the so-called island of Britain went to war for the following reasons. The Varni, who came from the lands beyond the river Ister, settled in the lands between the Arctic Ocean and the river Rhine, which separated them from the Franks and other peoples asterisk who lived there. All these tribes, who in ancient times lived on both sides of the river Rhine, each had its own name among the Germanic peoples, and all bore the common name of Germans. The island of Britain lies on this side of the ocean, not far, about 200 stadia from the mouth of the Rhine, and lies between Britain and the island of Thule. While Britain lies to the west of the extreme borders of Spain, about 400 stadia from the mainland, Britain lies opposite that end of Gaul which faces the ocean, i.e., to the north of Spain and Gaul. Thule, as far as these people know, lies at the northern end of the ocean. I have described Britain and Thule in my previous books. The island of Britain is inhabited by 3 populous peoples, each with its own king. The names of these peoples are the Angles, the Frisians, and the Britons, who are named after the island. Their numbers are so great that every year a large number of them, with their wives and children, migrate to the Franks. The latter settle them in those areas that are considered the most sparsely populated and therefore claim that this island belongs to them. And indeed, not long ago, the king of the Franks sent a delegation of his close and trusted men to the Emperor Justinian, including several men from the Angles, proudly declaring that this island was under his rule. This can be said about the island of Britain. At the same time that John was waiting for Narses in Salonika, Narses, busy with the invasion of the Huns, was moving too slowly. Totila, having learned of Narses' appointment and awaiting his army, did the following. He settled all the remaining Romans and some of the senators in Rome, and sent the rest to Campania. And although they had experienced the power of the barbarians for many centuries, they nevertheless preserved what had been built in the city and most of its decorations as far as possible. These works of art were created with such durability by their creators that neither the passage of time nor neglect has destroyed them. Among them are monuments from the beginning of the Roman era. Thus, the ship of Aeneas, the founder of the city, lies here and is an incredible sight. Those who built the pier and docks in the center of the city, on the banks of the Tiber, placed this ship there and keep it there. I will describe it myself as I saw it with my own eyes. This ship has a single row of oars and is very long, 120 feet in length, 25 feet in width, and as high as necessary for rowing. The wood from which it is assembled is joined together without the use of any iron or other mechanisms. All the wooden parts are made of a single material, which is impressive to see and hear, as far as is known, only in this ship. The keel is made from a single piece of wood from stern to bow and curves unusually so as to serve the hold, then rises again in a perfect line straight up to the deck. All the thick beams attached to the keel, some poets call them dryohai, others nomai, each completely intact, run from one end of the ship to the other. Curved on both sides, they form a very perfect curve to form a ship's hold. Built in this way, the ship is an extraordinary sight. None of the wood is rotten, none appears to be worm-eaten, and in all its parts the ship has a fresh appearance, as if it had just come out of the hands of the craftsmen who built it.